afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy days to come and listen to a presentation about the 401k or 403b or 457 that you have, depending on the plan that you're with. Just as a little bit of a heads up as we go through this presentation and talk through what our plans are today, a lot of this actually came from direct requests that we got from participants who were telling us, hey, you're going into a lot of detail on some of this stuff, but I'm really not even sure, what the difference between a 401k and an IRA is. So this is going to be pretty introductory to help make sure that you have good understanding of how those different concepts work. If there are specific questions that you have, or you're thinking, I really wish you guys would talk more about X, Y, or Z, I encourage you, please reach out. Let me know what kinds of things you have questions about so I can tailor that education more directly to you and your group. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get jumped in here. And I'm going to start out by sharing what our agenda is today. We're going to talk a little bit about what basic plan design is. What does it mean to be in a 401k plan or 403b or 457? What does it mean when people talk about a qualified plan? How do those things work? We'll talk a little bit about understanding our choices, what options are available to us within a retirement plan, what kinds of things we might want to be aware of when we're looking at maybe leaving employment where we're at, or we're getting ready to retire. What are our options for taking our money with us? What are things that we should be aware of? We'll talk about how much we should be saving, distributions and withdrawals, and then we'll talk a little bit about other resources that you have. So that's the game plan for our presentation today. Again, if you have questions as we're going through this, please feel free to pop them in the chat. And I will be stopping the recording to ask for specific questions as we go along. Okay, so we're going to start at the very, very top. The question that I was getting from people is, sometimes, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been in this biz for more than 25 years. And when we talk about 401k plans, I think there's sometimes this idea that people just automatically know what that is or what that means. So I thought it would be a good idea for us just to start by talking about what code sections mean, what that's telling us when we look at a retirement plan option. So when we look at the IRC, or the Internal Revenue Code, those shape the rules that are available for an employer's qualified plan. And when we talk about qualified, what we mean there is money sources that the IRS provides a tax advantaged status on. So if I invest my money in a qualified plan, I'm getting some kind of a tax advantage for doing so. So maybe it's I don't have to pay taxes until I move that money out, or maybe it's a Roth contribution, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we get into the presentation today. But the qualified status of that is really talking about a favorable tax treatment of the dollars that are invested. A person who's using that qualified investment vehicle doesn't generally pay taxes until the point in time they're withdrawn. There are going to be limits that are going to be specific to a qualified plan about what you can put in out of your own paycheck and what the employer can put in. So we'll talk a little bit about what those limits are. You're going to hear people talk about things like 401k. You might even hear people talk about 401a and are wondering what's that, or a 403b, or a 457b. All of these are just talking about different parts of the code section that deal with the kind of employer that we may be working for. So for example, if I have a 401k, what that means is it's a code section which allows employees to defer my money into the plan. There are rules that are going to apply for my deferral contributions. So the K is actually specific to a plan that allows for employer contributions. A 401a is going to govern employer-sponsored retirement plans that allows for both mandatory and voluntary contributions. So they're a little bit different. Most of the time, what we see people have if they work for a for-profit organization is they're going to have a 401k. That leads us to then the fourth bullet there, a 403b. So this is the code section which governs tax-sheltered annuities, and it offers employer-sponsored retirement plans for 501c3 exempt organizations. Usually we see this for like not-for-profit organizations will have a 403b. Those are the ones that we see more commonly here. The rules between a 403b and a 401k are very, very similar. There are some differences between those, but they're pretty minor, especially at the plan participant level. You're not really going to notice a whole lot of difference between a 401k and a 403b. In terms of a 457B, this is the code section that governs in governmental agencies. So this we see very often in states, municipalities, maybe hospitals that have some other kind of state-funded pension. Those state-funded pensions, like here in the state of Iowa, we have something called IPERS. If for public employee or government employees, they have this pension available to them through IPERS, but they can't make their own contributions to that. So in order to have something that allows for those contributions, some organizations will open up these 457Bs that allow for an employee to make their own contributions toward their retirement plan. But in those situations, so in a 457B, the difference is that an employer is not making contributions to a 457B because those are generally being made through the pension plan offered to state or governmental agencies. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview of the kinds of code sections that we're going to run into. So then let's talk a little bit about what the limits are for us within those. So in a 401k or 403b, we're going to have different kinds of contribution limits that are available for us. The elective deferrals, this is going to be the same for 401ks, 403bs, and 457bs. How much money I can have out of my own paycheck go into the 401k plan or the 403b plan or the 457b plan. So this does not count any employer contributions. In 2026, the limit is $24,500 if I'm under age 50. If I'm over age 50, I can put in an additional $8,000 as a catch-up contribution. So those are my what I can put in for my own paycheck. On top of that, there's something called a super catch-up. And the super catch-up is really pretty new. This is its second year that it's ever been available. And it is specific to employees who will be age 60, 61, 62, or 63 on December 31st of this year. If you're going to be one of those ages on December 31st of this year, your catch-up contribution is higher than the regular over age 50 folks. So if I am one of those ages, my regular deferral limit is $24,500, and then my super catch-up contribution is an additional $11,250. So if I wanted to, if I was 60, 61, 62, or 63 by the end of this year, I could put in $35,750 into the retirement plan of my own money. So those are the limits for our elective deferrals, what comes out of our paycheck. These are going to be indexed annually. So the IRS is going to give us these limits every single year. They have authority over which contribution limits will increase. Sometimes they stay the same. Sometimes they'll go up. Sometimes they'll move one and not the other. It's supposed to tie to inflation, but we're not always sure what the rules are that they're going to use to increase those. But they have generally gone up. Almost every year, one of those has gone up. So those limits will change on us each year. The one below that, you see the annual additions limit. What this is talking about is the amount of total contributions that can go into a 401k or a 403b plan that includes both your contributions and the employer's contributions. So that's why you'll see that in a 457B, there's no annual additions limit because a 457B doesn't allow for employer contributions. So the 401k or 403B, they're going to have one limit for our money and a separate limit for the employer's contribution piece of that. The total amount that can go into your 401k or 403b plan this year is $72,000. The $72,000 would be our annual additions limit. That does not count catch-up contributions, by the way. So that's the absolute most that could go into our 401k plan or 403b plan in the year 2026. The last thing I'm going to point out there is where it says mandatory Roth. So this is also a new provision that just hit this year in 2026. And this is saying if I was what they call a high earner, this is defined by the IRS. So the plan did not define this for us. If I earned over $150,000 in FICA wages in 2025, and I am catch-up age, so I have to be over age 50, If both of those things are true, and I choose to make catch-up contributions, those catch-up contributions must be made on a Roth basis. So let me give you a couple examples here to hopefully make that clear for people. So let's say I'm 40 years old and I earned $200,000 last year. Well, then this doesn't apply to me because I'm not old enough to make catch-up contributions. So I don't have a mandatory Roth restriction because I'm not old enough to make catch-up contributions. If I'm age 50 and I earned $120,000 last year, this provision doesn't impact me because I'm not over that wage earner limit. So I can put the money in pre-tax or Roth. It doesn't matter. I'm not required. It is only going to be for those individuals who earned more than $150,000 last year and choose to make catch-up contributions. If you're putting those catch-up contributions in 2026, those will need to be put in on a Roth basis. So a new rule, they've made limits a little bit more confusing for us. You'll see there's lots of moving parts in this. If you have questions about what the limits are for you, or you just want to walk through this with somebody that's very specific to your situation, give me a call, shoot me an email. I'm happy to go through that with you. I want to make sure that you know exactly how those limits will impact you. All right, so now we've kind of gone over the basics, right? How much money can I put into the plan? We've talked a little bit about what's the difference, when we see these code sections. I have a 401k, my neighbor has a 403b. What does that mean? We've talked a little bit about that. The next thing we want to do is make sure that we learn our plan. So every person here has access to something called a summary plan description that will talk specifically about the provisions within their plan. Every plan has its own rules. And I often tell people, the place we have to start and end in looking at our 401k plan is making sure we're reviewing that summary plan description so we know how the rules impact us. There are some provisions that are going to be a little bit more set in stone or more generally available than others. You'll see that there's lots of variability from one employer to the other in other pieces of the provisions. But what you're looking at here are going to be kind of the most important provisions that if I'm walking into a 401k plan or a 403b plan, I want to make sure I understand how those provisions work. These are the ones that are probably most important. First and foremost is eligibility and entry. How do I become eligible for the plan? It's usually going to be tied to service. Sometimes it's immediate. Sometimes you can wait up to a year before you've met the eligibility requirements. So you need to make sure that you're reviewing that within your summary plan description to identify within your plan how those provisions work for you. The deferral and compensation. Most employers will allow you to defer a percent, a flat dollar amount. Some employers will allow for a partial. Again, this is something where like a partial percent, like let's say 5.5%, something along those lines. Again, it's important to know what the rules are for you. I think most of the plans that we work with also allow for employer and employee to determine how you want the money to go in from a tax perspective, allowing both pre-tax and Roth. And that's going to be the same in a 401k or 403b or 457b. All of them are going to allow for that kind of variability. They'll allow you to be able to make changes periodically to your deferral amount. One of the differences between 401k plans and other employee benefits that we have, there's no enrollment time, right, for your 401k. You can sign up at any point and you can change your contributions throughout the year. Some plans will have restrictions on how frequently you can do that. Maybe it's monthly or quarterly. Some will say you can do it as soon as administratively feasible. Every plan is required to allow you to move your deferrals to zero at any point in time. So if you're sitting in that situation where you need to change your deferrals, every plan has to allow the ability for you to move your deferral contribution to zero effective essentially as soon as administratively feasible. They're also going to define in the plan the kinds of compensation that are included. This is important to note, especially if you're in a situation where let's say, you're going to be leaving employment at one company, moving to a different employer, or trying to understand how those work. You'll need to understand how things like if PTO is included, if maybe bonus is included in your deferral contribution. So compensation is something that will be defined in the plan, and they'll tell you what kinds of pay count as things that you can defer into the plan. very commonly you'll see that there'll be some things that aren't included. So for compensation, the example that I usually give for people is like reimbursements are not always included. So sometimes there'll be some questions about what kinds of compensation you're deferring on. If that's a question that you have, reach out, let me know. We can look at your plan together and talk through the kinds of compensation that are included and not included within your plan. Employer contributions. So this is something I point out all the time. Your employer making a contribution to a 401k plan is optional. So the fact that the plans that we work with have, match or profit share or stated contribution, that's a great benefit for you. They can be stated or discretionary. A discretionary just means that the employer has the ability to change that throughout time. So maybe they're making a match contribution and it's a discretionary match. Most of the companies that I've worked with, let's say their discretionary match is 50% of six. Most of them will leave it like that for years and years and years. But theoretically, that discretionary match gives them the ability to say, it's been a great year, let's increase that. Or they could change that. Most of the time, it's going to be pretty static, but know that when they say discretionary, that's what they're talking about is the ability for that to change. An employer can have matching contributions, profit sharing contributions, or something called a non-elective contribution. But like I said before, employer contributions to a 401k plan are not required. So having those contributions is a big deal, something to be really grateful for, as it helps you a lot as you get into retirement planning, making sure you have a little bit of extra contributions going in. When I talk with people about how much they should be putting into their 401k plan, I will always tell people at least put in enough to get the full match from your employer, to make sure that you're at least taking advantage of the contributions available to you through the plan to the degree you can. Employer contributions, the next one, are subject to vesting. So when we talk about vesting, it's just a fancy word for ownership. How long it takes us to own the money a 401k plan or an employer puts into our plan for us. These are going to be subject to vesting schedules. Sometimes they're immediate, but oftentimes they're going to be either a graded schedule or what we call a cliff schedule. They cannot exceed 6 years. So the longest you can have a vesting schedule is a graded 6-year that would give you full vesting by the time you've completed 6 years of service with the employer, or a 3-year vesting cliff. So if they go with a cliff, it has to be at least a 3-year cliff before you own 100%. I think with a graded schedule, it's 6 years is the longest that can be subject to. Something to note about that vesting schedule, when we talk about vesting, it's only ever going to be talking about employer monies. So your deferrals, what comes out of your paycheck, you always own those. Those always are yours. If vesting applies, it's going to be only to employer contributions. Rollovers. Most plans are going to allow for you to roll money over from one company to another. This is going to be important. We'll talk about this in more detail as we get to distributions and withdrawals. So I won't spend a lot of time on that now. Loans. Loans are, believe it or not, optional provisions. This is one of the questions I got from people that made it so important. I thought that we had a conversation about how 401k plans, how 403b plans kind of generally work. I think there's an idea out there that an employer is required to offer loans, and they are not. Loans are optional provisions within a plan. Having the ability to take a plan loan out is going to be governed by that plan. There will be limits that are imposed by the IRS. So the IRS tells us how much a minimum loan can be for. Can't be for less than $1,000, and they tell us what the maximum amount can be. So the IRS stipulates that the most you could take from your loan is 50% or $50,000, whichever is lesser. So let's say I have an account balance of $600. Well, I can't take a loan because the most I could take out would be 50% of my account balance, which would be $300, and that's less than $1,000. So that wouldn't be something that the plan would allow for within the loans, because that's actually dictated to us by the IRS. There's also going to be interest rates. The interest rates are usually determined by the plan. Most of the time, they're going to be connected to something like the prime rate. So we'll talk a little bit about how loans work as we get further in. All right, so we've talked about some of the high-level provisions. I want to hit just really quickly retirement, death, and disability. When we hit these events, you'd become immediately vested in any employer contributions that would be made available to you in the plan. That's an IRS requirement. A optional retirement age is essentially optional, but it can't exceed 65. So you could have a plan where they say that the normal retirement age is 60, but it can't be, 70. So every plan, the longest they can make you wait is 65 to be eligible for retirement. Again, death and disability, you become fully vested in those situations. Disability is something that will vary from plan to plan in terms of how it's defined. Most of the time, it's going to be tied to Social Security disability as an issue there. If that's something you have questions about, again, feel free to give me a call. Last thing we're going to talk about with respect to the kinds of provisions that are important is the in-service distribution. So if I'm actively employed, how can I get money out of the plan? We talked a little bit about loans, but as we mentioned, loans are optional. So not all plans allow for a loan out of the plan. If your plan does allow for in-service distributions, there are going to be optional provisions. Usually they're things like hardship, which is defined by the IRS. So the IRS tells us what hardship is. A hardship is going to be something like, I'm going to lose my home. It's going to be foreclosed on, or I'm going to be evicted. I have funeral expenses I can't pay. I have medical expenses that I can't pay, tuition expenses that I can't pay. Those things qualify as hardship. The other one is if I, need money for the purchase of my home. Those would be things that I could tap into my account for hardship. Or if my home has been damaged by a federally declared disaster, that might be something I can tap into my 401k plan for. But let's say like my car breaks down, that doesn't qualify as a hardship because the IRS tells us exactly what falls into the definition of a hardship. So be aware of that. If you're running into a situation where you're like, I'm just not sure, that's a great reason to give me a call, shoot me an email. I'm happy to walk through that with you. Another one that's pretty common is age 59 and a half. We'll talk about this a little bit as we get into distributions and withdrawals, but age 59 and a half is a magic age for a qualified retirement plan. That's the age where I can take money out of my qualified retirement plan without penalty. That doesn't mean that I won't owe taxes. It just means that I won't be subject to an additional 10% penalty tax for early withdrawal. So that age 59 and a half is an age that was set again. IRS chose that age. I have no idea why they picked 59 and a half, but that's the age that they chose. So these age 59 and a half distributions are generally available within a 401k plan. Again, there's something to reach out. Let me know if you have questions about. All right. So we've covered a lot so far. I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about those Roth contributions. We'll spend just a minute here, and then we're going to get into some more information about loans and distributions. So when we're thinking about a 401k plan or a 403b plan or a 457, if we have the option to consider Roth, it might make sense for us to do so. But there's I think it gets confused a lot about how 401k plans are different than things like Roth IRAs. So I think it bears spending just a minute talking about how a Roth within a qualified retirement plan like a 401k or a 403b or 457b is different than a Roth IRA. First and foremost, they have different limits. So a Roth IRA has something called an income limit that looks at your income or your income and if you're married filing jointly, your joint income. And if you earn over a specific amount, they will disallow Roth contributions within a Roth IRA. But that does not apply to a 401k, a 403b, or a 457b. It does not matter if you earn $5,000 a year or $5 million a year. If you want to make contributions into your 401k or your 403b as a Roth, you can do that. Contribution limits in a Roth IRA are considerably less than what your contribution limits are for the 401k, 403b, or 457b. So as remember, we talked about on our general limit slide, our contribution limit is $24,500 if I'm under age 50. It could be as high as $33,750 if I'm, one of those super catch-up ages. I can do the whole thing as Roth if I want to in a 401k or 403b plan. But in a Roth IRA, my limit is $7,500 if I'm under age 50 and $8,600 if I'm over age 50. So my contribution limits are much, much higher on a 401k or a 403b than they are with a Roth IRA. You can split your deferrals up any way you want. You just can't exceed the overall limit that's been stated. You're going to need to make any contributions to a 401k or 403b or 457 through payroll. So can't send somebody a check and have them put that into the plan for you. It's got to be done through payroll. But the other thing I'll point out is that you can make contributions to both a Roth IRA and a Roth in your 401k or 403b in the same year, assuming you don't have any income limits. So why would we consider Roth anyway? So I've spent all this time talking about how you can use it. Well, the reason we want to consider Roth as an option for us is because of the tax advantages that Roth might offer to us. When we put our money in on a pre-tax basis, what's happening is it lowers my taxable income today. That grows for me tax deferred over time. But when I go to take that money out, I have to pay taxes on all of that I withdraw at the point in time that I withdraw. So if I grow my account balance and I take out part of it in a year, I'm going to pay taxes on the part that I withdraw every year because I've never paid $1 in taxes on that. In Roth contributions, what we do is we're going to pay their taxes first on the way in. That grows for us tax deferred over time. But then the trade-off is as long as I'm over age 59 and a half, remember that distribution age the IRS set for us, and I've had the account established for at least 5 years, if I meet those two requirements, I can take out what I put in plus the interest it earned without paying taxes on it later. So Roth can be really beneficial as a way to increase our contributions and make them a little bit more tax efficient through distributions. A question I get all the time for people is then, well, which one should I use? Is pre-tax better or is Roth better? And I'll tell you, each situation is going to be unique depending on what your family's income looks like, what your needs are, what your overall savings looks like. But there are some rules of thumb that can help you make that decision. One of them being, if I know I have a pretty long time horizon, remember I said the benefit is I get to pull that money out plus the interest it earns without taxes down the road. Well, that means that if I have a long time for that to compound interest, I can really earn a lot of interest that I can pull out without paying taxes down the road. If I think I'm going to be in a higher tax bracket later on than I am now, this is really important for folks who are maybe just getting into their working careers. We're usually in our lowest tax brackets in the first few years of employment. If we can sock that away on a Roth basis, we're not going to be paying anywhere near the amount of taxes that we would be paying on that if we were waiting to make those contributions as we got further into our career. We're comfortable with market risk. Again, this kind of ties to the whole point is to out earn the taxes. So if I want to have good compound interest growth, I probably want to make sure that I'm a pretty aggressive investor. If I'm just investing in like a cash instrument that's not giving me a whole lot of return, well, then probably not going to out earn that interest over time. So Roth may not make as much sense in that situation. The last one there is then if I recognize a need for tax diversification in retirement. This gets to there are going to be people that will have a need to do something called a conversion where they take pre-tax money and they turn it into Roth money later on. Usually we're doing that because we need some kind of tax diversification in retirement. We know that we're going to have to be planning for years later on past age 73 when I'm required minimum distribution eligible. And I want to have money that I can pull out later and let that grow for me. So that can be a real need for people. If you're in that boat and you're trying to figure out, hey, do I do a Roth conversion? Should I be doing Roth now? Give me a call, shoot me an email. That's what I'm here to help you do. All right. So then we've talked about kind of how plans work. What should we be considering with whether that's pre-tax or Roth contributions? Let's talk about how we make the most out of the plan that we have. What we will be telling anybody is that in order for you to have enough to live on when you get to retirement, you probably should be saving in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% of your income year over year in order for you to have enough to do that. The good news is your employer contributions will count toward that 10 to 15%. So if, for example, you're being matched 100% up to 4, that 4% counts. So if I put in 4, I'm getting 4 from my employer, that's 8%. What I've done here is to give you a couple different ideas of what that would look like. So this is saying, assuming I earn 50,000 a year, I'm getting a 2% annual raise and I'm able to save for 30 years. So I'm starting at age 35. This shows you if I save 5% of pay, and that's going to be my deferrals. If I have employer contributions counting toward that, if I'm saving 5% of my pay, I will have contributed over that 30-year period about $124,000 to get about $471,000 when I hit retirement. If I can bump that up to 8%, you'll see that that's going to be a total contribution over that period of time of just shy of $200,000 for a total distribution, my total value at about $750,000. So what I hope that this helps you see is how important it is, even if you can't get yourself to 10 or 12% or 15% right off the bat, toward working into that number and making sure that you're using your employer's plan to the best of your ability so that you can use that to help you grow into greater savings. So again, going back to the example of if I am saving 100%, if I am getting a match of 100% of 4, if I can get myself to 6% of pay, I get 4% from my employer. That's a 10% contribution. That's going to be getting me pretty far. If I can increase that just a little bit more over time, maybe increase that 1 or 2% a year until I get myself to 8%. Now I'm at 12% of my overall savings. You can see what that might look like for a person who's able to save. So I encourage you, use your plans best you can. Try to get yourself into that good savings rate. And I always point out some kind of trade-offs for that, right? What does that look like? What does that feel like if we're going to be saving different amounts? So again, using the example, if I make 50,000 a year, if I make 50,000 a year, 3% of my pay is going to be about $29 per week. And if I can get myself to 5% of pay, that's going to be about 48%, $48 per week based on that. So I've just given you some ideas of like, how does that line up to other savings or other habits that we might have? Picking on myself a little bit here. If I get a Jimmy John's 3 times a week, this is my specific order at Jimmy John's. It's the number 2 with chips and a drink. If I get that, it's $15.58 every time I do it. If I do that just 3 times a week, that's almost 5% of pay. I do that more to help you identify what that looks like and feels like to a person who's saving, so you can see what might make the most sense for you as you get going. But like I said earlier, if you can start at 2% today, start at 2% and try to increase that over time. Make it a goal to get yourself into that 10 to 15% range. Then I'm going to tell you to be very, very cautious about using. So we're going to shift now into talking about distributions and withdrawals from your plan. I'm going to tell you to be very cautious about taking money out of your 401k plan early. I think it can sometimes feel like the easiest way to get out of a pickle is to take a loan out of your 401k plan or your 403b plan. That can really put you in a bad spot. What we know from all the research that's been done is that people who take loans out are generally not saving as much as they should be. They feel less confident about their retirement future. It can make it feel more difficult to save. A lot of times those loans are going to be attributed to just not having enough emergency savings overall. What we see is kind of what it costs us to take that loan out. So this is giving you an example of what it actually essentially costs to take a loan out of your 401k plan. We're going to assume our prime rate is what we're using for the interest rate, which is most common in most plans. It's usually tied to the prime rate, sometimes prime plus 1 or prime plus 2. So that would mean that my interest rate in this example is 6.75% is my prime. And we're going to say that in this example, it's going to be a prime plus a little over 1.5. If I borrowed $10,000 from my 401k plan, if I have that invested in an account, it's possible, depending on where I'm at, that I could have earned about 15% on that, depending on the investment I was in. If I'm paying 8.5% interest, it takes me 5 years to repay that loan. If my loan is repaid on time, I'm going to lose about $16,000 by taking that loan out now. If I don't take that loan out, what's going to happen is that the amount that I didn't repay becomes taxable to me with penalty in the year that loan was essentially defaulted. So that can add up over time. As you see here, If I didn't repay that loan and it was subject to a 10% penalty, my loss increases to $227,000. Loans can really cost you and they can really set you back. I understand there's sometimes a need, and gosh, it's the option you got to go with. But what you want to know is if you're in that boat where you're looking to take a loan, you're probably going to have to work harder to catch up than you initially thought. It's not quite as simple as just paying yourself back because you're losing out on the compound interest that money would have made for you while you're repaying it. And that leads me to then understanding the benefit events, penalties, and considerations when we start to pull money out of qualified retirement plans. This is important that we understand what our options are. As much as I want to thank every person who's on this call, you're going to stay with your employer forever. Chances are we're probably going to be looking to move at some point. We'll probably make a change in our career. And as we make those changes in our career, we want to know what happens to the money in our retirement plan and how that's treated. So, our options. If I had a benefit event, so I terminate employment is usually what we think of with a benefit event. So when I've separated service with my employer, I'm eligible to take a withdrawal of my entire vested amount. So any portion of the account that I'm fully vested in, I can take with me. If I roll that money over, so this is going through our three main options. I can roll that money over. I can either roll it to another 401k plan or 403b or 457, or I can roll it to my own IRA. If I do that, it's a non-taxable event. I will get something called a 1099 for it, but it will show up as a non-taxable event. I'll maintain tax deferred growth on that. So tax advantage status will stay. I'll avoid that early withdrawal penalty, and it won't be subject to creditors or bankruptcy if it goes to another 401k plan. So when our money sits in a 401k or a 403b or 457, it is not considered from a creditor perspective. It's not considered an asset of the company. It is really truly considered your asset. So they are protected from bankruptcy if we have our money in a qualified employer retirement plan. On the flip side of that, what do we need to be aware of? Well, we need to make sure we understand what the costs are for rolling it over, making sure we understand what the investment vehicles are that are available to us, and make sure that we understand what kind of protection we may be giving up for the rollover that we're doing. So understanding those options is important so that you know how your assets are protected as you go forward. The second option is you can leave your money in the plan. So if our assets are greater than $7,000, we can leave our assets in a 401k plan and come back and get them at a later time. So if you leave employment, you don't have to make decisions about what happens to your money right away. You can take your time and make the right decision for you. In those situations, what you're going to want to do, what you're going to want to understand is you're maintaining that tax deferred status. If you keep it there, you're avoiding early withdrawal penalties. You're not going to be subject to creditors of the company by leaving it in the 401k or 403b plan. The cons, though, want to be aware we're going to be limited to the investment choice available to the plan. We're subject to the plan's provisions, its fees. We want to make sure that we understand how those work. It could be subject to future changes, which we see this happen from time to time. Maybe you worked at an employer before and you've gone through this too, where you left your money at the plan and then you got a notice maybe a year or two later that they were going to be moving providers. So they were switching from, let's say, Fidelity to Empower. And when they do that, all of your account information moves. So you kind of lose access to that information through Fidelity, and you have to regain that access through the new provider. In those situations, it can be kind of confusing to follow, especially if you're not, still tied into the employer. That's something that's important to understand and make sure that you're following these. So if you do decide to leave your money at an employer, you really want to make sure that you are keeping up to speed on the situations within the plan, that you keep your address, your email, your phone number, all of those things up to date so that if something happens, they have a way to contact you. Last is the cash out or in a small amount force out. So this would be if our account is less than $7,000, or if we leave employment and we just want them to send us a check. You can have immediate access to your investment when you terminate employment. They'll send you a check for all the money. But what you want to understand is there can be significant tax implications by doing that. So when I take a distribution out of my 401k plan as a cash out, what's going to happen is there's a 20% mandatory federal withholding that's not set by your company. It's not set by the provider. That is a federal requirement. They're going to withhold 20% of that for taxes. On top of that, if you are under age 59 and a half, you will be subject to an additional 10% penalty tax. On top of that, if you have not elected to have state taxes withdrawn, state taxes may also be due. So these can have really deleterious effects to you if you take huge distributions out of your 401k plan. If you're considering it, it's something you should absolutely be talking to your accountant about. Sit down and maybe run some numbers on it, have a sense of what that could look like for you from a tax perspective so you don't get an ugly surprise when you file your taxes in the following year. All right, so we have hit all of the information about your 401k plan, kind of high level. What does it mean to have a 401k plan? What are our general provisions? What does it mean to do Roth? How do we get money out of the plan? Let's just tie this up real quickly by talking quickly about making sure from an investments perspective, most plans are what we call participant directed, which means that you choose how you want your assets to be invested within the plan. Many plans, and I think most of the folks who are on this call, you're going to be in the same boat, will have some kind of a qualified default investment alternative. That qualified default is usually something like a target date fund that's going to be investing you in a pretty well diversified group of investments. It seems appropriate for a person of your age, but you can always take control of your own investments. It's important that you understand what options are available to you, that you set up an allocation it's going to be consistent with your goals. Helps you kind of look at what your options are. If this is something that you're like, I have no idea, again, something to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you set up an asset allocation that meets your needs. And then over time, we want to make sure that we're rebalancing those portfolios. So once you set an allocation, once you look at the investments that are in your plan, make sure that you're going back and you're revisiting those over time. Because what can happen is that we can have situations where our portfolio, as it earns interest, might kind of fall out of whack with our original target. So again, things to chat about. If you've got questions, you can always reach out to me and shoot me an email, give me a call. I'm more than happy to work through your situation. All right, so we have made it through here. These are some resources that are available for you on a number of different topics. We've got webinars, articles, calculators, and videos that are available for you on our website. You'll also see my contact information is here as well, my email and phone if you would like to reach out to ask questions about anything that we've covered today or go through your plan in more specific detail. I'd be happy to do that. At this point, I'm going to stop our recording. So if you have questions, feel free to start